A final push by the Biden administration to stop Israel's war on Gaza. 2 top officials are in the region to hold talks on how to stop the fighting and secure the release of captives. So what's bringing the negotiators back to the table? And is a ceasefire deal possible? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Bernard Smith. Palestinians and Israelis are signalling they're making new efforts to pause the fighting in Gaza. Any deal is expected to involve an exchange of Israeli captives for Palestinian prisoners. US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and Secretary of State Antony Blinken are both in the region trying to drive the negotiations. Qatar has resumed its mediation role, along with Egypt. Any truce would be the second since the start of the war in October last year. So what's changed to allow these talks to restart weeks before Joe Biden steps down? How long might a ceasefire last? And how many captives and prisoners could be released? We'll take up these questions with our guests shortly, but first this report by Sarah Gill.
These Israeli protesters have a new name for their Prime Minister. Mr. Sacrifice.
We are standing here today to remind Netanyahu that this is his greatest crime, the abandonment of hostages. We still have 100 hostages in Gaza. For over a year now, he has been jeopardizing deals wherever he goes, and all while prioritizing his bloody coalition. We call him Mr. Abandonment, Mr. Sacrifice.
As Israel continues its unrelenting war on Gaza, Benjamin Netanyahu's government is facing mounting pressure to end it.
Those in favor of draft resolution.
The United Nations General Assembly voted overwhelmingly on Wednesday to demand an immediate ceasefire. And while the resolution is non-binding, it makes clear international support for Palestinians in the Strip is growing.
Justice must be served and impunity must end. Israel is continuing with its genocide, nevertheless.
Gaza doesn't exist anymore. It is destroyed. Palestinians are facing hunger, despair, and death. We have said it before. History is the harshest critic of inaction. And history is being written as we sit here today.
Israel's staunched ally, the United States, vetoed the Gaza ceasefire resolution, the 4th time the Biden administration has done so. But it sent its top diplomats to the region for another round of talks in what's believed to be a final push by the outgoing administration to secure a deal.
Do you know?
Other key mediators in the region say peace can be achieved if all sides are serious.
It's all about the main questions. Is there a willingness to end the war? Yes or no? Is there a willingness to have an exchange deal? Yes or no? Those are 2 very simple questions with very simple answers. If the answers are yes on both questions, then we have a deal.
But despite resumed efforts to reach a ceasefire, on the ground, Palestinians continue to suffer the brutal realities of war. More displacement, more destruction, and more loss of innocent lives. Sarah Gill, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
All right, let's bring in our guests. Tahani Mustafa is a senior analyst on Palestine at the International Crisis Group. She joins us from Amman. Menachem Klein is a former negotiator and professor of political science at Bar Ilan University. He joins us from Herzliya in Israel. And joining us by Skype from Doha is Omar Rehman, a fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. A warm welcome to you all. Omar, I'll start with you. Do you think, from what you're hearing, that a deal does look likely this time round?
Well, I'd caution any of your viewers to accept progress in these talks at face value. Over the past year, we've seen many times in which talks or progress towards talks have been manipulated rather cynically by various parties for various ends. And so there may be, I'm not saying that there's not momentum this time around or that they're not close to a deal, but certainly I would take it with a grain of salt. That being said, I don't see any fundamental difference this time in terms of the main issue, which has frustrated talks before, which is the fact that Israel desires a permanent military presence in the Gaza Strip, or a long-term military presence, and has had no end so far in ending its military campaign in the Gaza Strip, the overriding purpose of which is to destroy Gaza and ethnically cleanse the population. So I haven't seen any change in that. Where there may be a difference is that maybe Hamas fighters, have either looked at the situation in terms of the debilitation of the axis of resistance and think, well, nobody's coming to save us. There's not going to be any change. Maybe we can come to terms on some type of temporary ceasefire where we release the hostages, we get some relief, and we can move into a different phase of this conflict. Almost a leap of faith into the Trump administration's ability to bring about an end of hostilities. Or there could be some other reason. Maybe the hostages themselves are close to death. They can't take care of them anymore, and so they might as well trade them for something.
Tahani, Omar touched on it there. Is Hamas perhaps more isolated now with the peace deal, ceasefire deal that Israel has signed with Hezbollah? Might that mean there might be more likelihood of a deal this time around?
Well, I would definitely warn caution about taking events in Syria and Lebanon as the sorts of goalposts that will influence in any way the potential of a Gaza ceasefire. I think, as Omar touched upon, what we have seen since the 7th of October over the last year is that Israel is likely to try and get away with whatever it can. And I think it seems that Israel, now with Trump soon coming into office, may try considering trading a ceasefire for Trump by allowing, the total annexation, and increased settlement activity in the West Bank. So I think, if we do see a ceasefire in Gaza, it's likely going to be a mechanism for Israel to continue to do what it's doing now, its campaign in Gaza, but with political cover, much as it has done in the case of Lebanon and the so-called ceasefire that Israel was able to then negotiate, impose on Lebanon, and then at the same time violate.
Menachem, we are hearing suggestions that Qatar's Prime Minister said that we've sensed that after the election, the US election, that momentum is coming back. From the Israeli perspective, is now a better time for a deal? Do you see momentum from the Israeli side?
The Israeli society suffers or mourn the casualties that we suffer on every day. Every day wake up to see young faces of young soldiers on the front page of our newspapers and on screen. Israel suffers casualties. It's not going so well to hold Gaza Strip. Therefore, Israel is ready to an interim, to take a break in the operation in Gaza. The key question is who are the Palestinian prisoners that Israel agrees to release in exchange of the hostages? This is yet unknown. But Israel enters or is willing to negotiate on a deal not from a strong and powerful point, but from weakness. The army is fatigued. We have a problem. The army has a problem to continue fighting full scale. It must take a break. And this weakness brings Netanyahu and the government to talk on the deal and covering it up. They cover up their weakness with arguing that what happened in Syria is because our successful operation in Lebanon.
Menachem, thank you very much for that. Omar, I take your initial hesitation to believe that there might be something in the offing this time round because we have been here before. But the region has changed since the last time round. Hamas is more isolated after what's happened in Lebanon. And Menachem touched on the weakness or the need of the Israeli military to sort of take a pause. The circumstances lend themselves, don't they, more now to some sort of agreement than they had previously?
Well, I agree with you that the kind of ancillary or the regional context has changed enough that it could influence the calculations of the various parties, both Israel and Hamas and Islamic Jihad on the ground. That being said, there was a fundamental issue here that had frustrated any progress towards talks in the past, and that is Hamas was demanding an end to the fighting, an indefinite end to the fighting, and a removal of Israeli soldiers from the Gaza Strip. Netanyahu refused that. Again, its point of view and its objective was to place a permanent military presence in the Gaza Strip to ethnically cleanse not just the north, really the whole of the Gaza Strip, but when Egypt refused to open its borders, those plans evolved. So we've seen that take place. Israel has achieved many of its objectives. The Gaza Strip has been destroyed. Its population is pushed out of most of the north at this point, and Hamas is a weakened force. So they may come to an agreement, but I don't think they're going to come to an agreement on the original terms of the agreement. And Hamas has to take a leap of faith that with no guarantee that once they release those hostages, Israel's not going to keep the fighting going once again or resume the fighting. That was another sticking point in the past. There was nobody to guarantee that. The only one that had the leverage over Israel to make it comply was the United States, who showed no ability or willingness to put that type of leverage pressure over Israel in the past. And so Hamas had no guarantee the end of fighting. Maybe this time around, again, we have seen a different calculation. They're willing to concede those points and say, we just need an end to the fighting and a hope that that end to the fighting holds under a Trump administration.
Tahani, it would take a leap of faith, wouldn't it, as Omar says, from Hamas. They have previously insisted on a completed Israeli withdrawal. Israel's never going to agree to that. In fact, we've seen Israel building military infrastructure along the middle of Gaza to split it into two. So why will Hamas now might Hamas take this leap of faith?
Look, I don't think Hamas's current sort of proposal now is a significant leap, from what it has previously demanded. Hamas has shown that it is willing to be flexible, at least in terms of the language being used in these ceasefire discussions and negotiations. We've seen it shift its goalposts over the last year in terms of at first demanding a total cessation of an immediate and total cessation of hostilities to then agreeing to a phased process. And now with this current agreement where, Hamas has been a bit more lenient about its demand about the complete removal of any Israeli ground troops in Gaza, and now, insisting that it be a temporary process until, a total cessation of hostilities takes effect. Now, I think also at the same time, again, I would be really cautious about the leveling this at the axis of resistance and events in Syria and Lebanon, and more about the pressure that Hamas is now experiencing from regional mediators, especially Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Egypt, where we've seen, especially over the last couple of weeks, there's been immense pressure on Hamas to try and engage in negotiation talks, to work with Fatah about, in terms of handing over governance of Gaza, committing to agreements that only months prior it was very unlikely for Hamas to have agreed to in terms of reconciliation talks, and now with these negotiations. So I think definitely the pressure is more coming from regional mediators, but also the fact that even domestically now, Hamas is seeing a significant plummet in its popularity, not just in places like Gaza, but even in the West Bank.
And Menachem, just to stick with this issue of Israeli troops in Gaza, they are putting in infrastructure there in the middle of Gaza, as we've said. Israel is never leaving Gaza, is it? What do you think the plan there is for the Israelis?
Israel is preparing to stay for long in Gaza Strip. There is no agency in the horizon that is preparing to replace the Israeli army. It will be governed by the military. So it seems to me. It also seems to me that Hamas concluded that they cannot impose on Israel to leave Gaza Strip. However, Hamas enjoys a veto power that without its agreement, no one can rule Gaza. What does it mean for the Israelis? It means war of attrition, guerrilla war against Israeli army, and casualties that Israel will suffer as long as Israel stays in Gaza. We, as I say, as an Israeli, I think that we are repeating our bloody experience in South Lebanon. That's the situation now in Gaza, and for the fourth time seeing, this will hold on.
OK, Menachem, thank you. Omar, Donald Trump said there would be all hell to pay in the Middle East if the captives were not released by his inauguration in January. Has what he's said really had an impact here? Do Qatar, Egypt, Hamas and Israel, are they all trying to avoid the blame if there is no truce deal before then?
Perhaps some of them are trying to avoid the blame. I think Gaza is already a hell, so I'm not sure there's anything that Trump can do. I don't know what he means by that, but I don't think there's anything he can do to worsen the situation for the people of Gaza who are suffering a genocide at the hands of Israel. It doesn't get worse than that. At the same time, I agree with what Tahani said. There is pressure on those actors that have been the mediators, Qatar, Egypt, and others to take a more proactive role at this point. Qatar had already kind of paused the mediation because it wasn't going anywhere. It was acting as a cover. Now Trump has come and said, we want to restart these talks. I don't want this going on when I take office on January 20th. And so I think they've taken on a new kind of urgency, and maybe they're pressuring Hamas where they can in order to comply. So I think that is a bit of a change in dynamic. But in terms of what Trump was saying, I really don't know what further the United States can do to make the life of the people in Gaza more of a hell than it already is.
Tahani, did what Trump say, is it having any impact? Are the various parties in this trying to avoid the risk of carrying the blame if there isn't a deal?
I think there's definitely pressures in different directions, but I don't think it's necessarily with regards to what's happening in Gaza per se, but more to do with the respective interests of those regional mediators that are involved. What's happening in Gaza the day after is going to have huge ramifications for Egypt that shares a border with Gaza. Saudi has its own interest here in terms of the normalization deal that's been put on the back burner since this recent onslaught. So I think there are various interests at play here, and it may not necessarily do with the kinds of threats that Trump is sort of initiating. I think, as Omar said, how much worse can things get for Palestinians, especially in Gaza? But effectively, what you're seeing still is the lack of international accountability that has effectively enabled Israel to commit what the UN describes as a genocide is only going to be further enhanced under Trump. Where Biden did nothing to curb Israel or limit its access to US weaponry. I think Trump is likely to actively encourage Israel, not just to get things finished in Gaza faster, but also, at least from where the kinds of statements we're seeing and the sorts of people that he's appointed, I think he's going to most likely actively overlook whatever else Israel does in places like Lebanon, Syria, and the West Bank.
I mean, Menachem, for the Palestinians in Gaza, we're to hope there will be a pause to give them some measure of relief. But if there is, would it be harder for Israel to restart the fighting if let's say, for argument's sake, there's a 60-day pause or truce or ceasefire?
I am quite sure that Israel will find the excuse to resume the war in Gaza. But the Israeli right wing, I would like to add regarding Trump, is Israeli right wing started preparing a scheme, a scenario regarding the West Bank to coordinate it with Trump administration. So from the Israeli right wing perspective, Gaza is done. It's ours. We control it. That's fine. Now let's work on the West Bank. This is the next target. I suggest not abandoning the West Bank because of the great humanitarian crisis and tragedy and the bloodshed and the genocide in Gaza Strip.
OK, well, Menachem, just on sticking with Netanyahu, what are his calculations then? Is it, OK, I've got a ceasefire with Hezbollah in Lebanon, al-Assad is gone, so Gaza is weakened, I'm in a stronger position to be able to make any minor compromises I might have to?
Definitely right. You are absolutely right. This is his calculation. He can say, I brought home hostages, those who are alive and the bodies of the dead ones, not all of them, but we will work and we will continue our fighting and operate in order to bring all of them back home. He will gain some points in the public opinion, not all the points. Many will criticize him either for making concessions to Hamas or abandoning the rest of the hostages, but he can gain something from the public opinion and maintain his base. That's exactly what he's doing. He wants to keep his base with him. Public opinion, Israeli public opinion, shows that there is a criticism on Netanyahu of abandoning the hostages. So he must confront this and the casualties that Israel suffers in Gaza and the army fatigue in Gaza. So he has more to gain than to lose in his calculation.
Omar, is that it, that Netanyahu is comparatively now in a position of strength to be able to make any minor concessions he might need to?
Yeah, again, I think what's transpired in Gaza, he's had the time and the resources to destroy the Gaza Strip and push the people out of the north. So in that sense, he's achieved one of his overriding aims. Whether he got a total victory over Hamas or not, that's not the case. But I think he's in such a position now, especially with what's happened in Lebanon as well as Syria, that he can kind of look towards, if he can, making a hostage deal that brings those hostages home and relieves some of the pressure points within his own society. I mean, again, we're at a point where he's also on trial. He's got a lot of things going on in which he's trying to deflect from and repair his image in front of his public. So that would be one step in doing that, I think.
And Omar, do we know what influence, what impact the condition of Palestinians in Gaza is having on Hamas's calculations? Do we have any idea how that affects them?
I don't know, but it can't be good. I mean, the situation is so immensely dire that, I think if Hamas is in a position where it wants to do whatever it can, probably to relieve that situation. If that means coming to some kind of deal, maybe they're ready to do that.
Tahani, we've seen information, we've seen satellite images recently of construction work around the Rafah crossing and an indication that maybe improved access to Rafah, reopening of that might be in any deal. Practically, how important is it for Palestinians in that part of Gaza to get the Rafah crossing open and running again?
Well, I mean, it's absolutely critical considering Rafah was one of the kind of lifelines for Gaza before the 7th of October in terms of not just the entry of aid, but also the actual movement of people in and out. So I think, that would certainly have to be, an absolutely critical point in any sort of negotiation process here.
And in terms of what the Palestinians need more of, obviously it's much more aid, but in terms of how critical, you've said how critical the situation is, but how much more aid do they need getting in there and how quickly do they need it?
Well, look, I mean, the situation is absolutely dire right now. Yes, there are substantial amounts of aid that need to meet the requirements of the population. Never mind the north, but even in the south is not faring any better right now. And what we are seeing right now is that nowhere near the amounts of aid that is required is actually getting in, even into the south. And with recent reports at the moment coming in about looting and the fact that I think just a couple of weeks ago you had something like over 100 UNRWA trucks, and I think 90% of those were literally held at a standstill while looters literally robbed everything on those trucks, and they did it in full view of the IDF. So right now, the entire strip, never mind the north, but even the south, those pockets in the south are in complete dire need.
OK. Menachem, captives' families and supporters have been protesting in great numbers in Tel Aviv and elsewhere in Israel almost since the beginning of October, since the start of this fighting. How influential have they been on this, or is Netanyahu being much more opportunistic?
it seems that the influence, the public opinion influence, is limited, but it's gaining more and more momentum on Netanyahu as long as other reasons join and other developments happen. So by itself, the protest, the call, bring them all home now, failed to push Netanyahu unless there are other reasons that bring him to agree to a temporary pause, a temporary ceasefire in Gaza. So I must say it in so many words, and it is expressed in Israeli public. The hostages are not part of Netanyahu's base. They are from his opposition, and this limits the pressure that can be put on Netanyahu. Count the very rare opportunities or occasions that Netanyahu met with the families of the hostages' families, not those who support him, but those who are in the opposition. Very few meetings.
Omar, we've mentioned this. We have been here before. It's at the very last minute. It's all gone wrong. Hamas has been blamed. Israel has been blamed. Hamas is a very different organisation, though, to when Sinwar was in charge. Its leadership is more of a cooperative now. Might we see more of an opportunity for some sort of deal, however limited this time? The Palestinians in Gaza would hope so.
Again, I think Hamas may be more amenable this time around. It doesn't have the same leadership, although, again, I don't think it was its leadership that was the problem. The problem was they wanted to see an end to the fighting, permanent end to the fighting, and the removal of the Israeli military from the Gaza Strip. That didn't happen. That was not going to happen under Netanyahu. And so there was nobody stopping the Israeli military from its campaign. And so, we are where we are. At this point, after all the losses that the people of Gaza have suffered, and the fact that, you have to keep these hostages alive and safe for 14 months. Yes. It's possible that the Hamas is unable to do that. And so maybe at this point, it's willing to trade those hostages in exchange for something. All right.
Folks, thanks very much for your very important insights. We're out of time, but thank you to Tahani and Mustafa, to Menachem, Klein, and to Omar, Rehman, and to thank you, too, for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Bernard Smith, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.